The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Economics investigates the causes and sources of prosperity and the creation of wealth. Alabama is a relatively poor state, so economics should be able to offer some perspectives on what our state must do to become more prosperous. Entrepreneurship is vitally important to the growth and prosperity of economies. So does Alabama's continuing poverty suggest that perhaps we have an entrepreneurship problem? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss where Alabama stands on some measures of entrepreneurship is Troy University master's student Will Pouncy. And he's been working on this question in a forthcoming study for the Johnson Center. Welcome to the show, Will.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here to Troy?
Well, it's hard to remember back that far. I've been here for a while. I came from Coos Valley Academy in Harpersville, Alabama, from the Birmingham area. Been there all my life. So I think I got to Troy 2014 and have been here studying economics. I probably declared back in 2015 or 2016 and decided that I was interested enough in the subject to stick around and do the master's degree, and thankfully, due to yourself and several of the other staff members, that's been a really great experience getting to work on some of these projects.
And your schedule's here to finish up in a couple months.
Yeah, I'll be done. I guess we're kind of accelerated now with the conditions, so I think about end of November we'll be wrapping everything up.
Well, we'll be sorry to see you go, but that's the good thing with students. When you work with students and then they finish their degrees, and that they're supposed to move on and get on with life. So
yep.
We've been very glad to have you here as part
Appreciate
of our program. So let's get started here today with this question about whether Alabama has an entrepreneurship problem. Yeah. And so to begin with, let's talk about where our state stands in terms of income here.
Well, just in general, with most of the economic statistics, we tend to rank below average towards the bottom of the pack. So when you're talking about, like median income, especially when, you start getting into, even when you start adjusting for, cost of living and that kind of thing, we tend to be in that bottom third, bottom 20 to 30%, just depending on the exact numbers that you're looking at. But that's one of the major problems that we face, is that in terms of just income, we're a relatively poor state.
And you mentioned this, but Alabama has a relatively low cost of living, but that's not enough to offset.
That's the first pushback that people kind of offer is, well, yeah, income is lower, but we have low cost of living as well. And so if you go and you adjust those, the median income numbers for cost of living, we still, I think, as of 2019, I want to say that we were 33rd, so it's not quite as bad, but it still certainly is below average.
Now, one of the things that helps drive some economies, especially if you look at Seattle, Washington, and other places, it's been the growth of companies like Amazon and Microsoft.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that if you look at Alabama, what sort of separates us is that we don't have any of these major new corporations that have emerged over the last 20 or 30 or 50 years in our headquarters here, right?
Yeah, so dating back to late 1990s, early 2000s, we had at any given time between 6 and 10 companies that would be on the Fortune 500 list. And at this point right now we have one company. I think Regions ranks about 447 on that Fortune 500 list. And it's worth noting there are two other companies that are in the, I think, Vulcan Materials and one other health company that the name is slipping my mind at the moment. But they're in the top 1,000. So it's not that large corporations are totally absent from the state. But as far as having real Fortune 500 companies and highly ranking Fortune 500 companies, we seem to be kind of sliding in that.
And especially with them headquartered here, because
Exactly.
in the recent sweepstakes for Amazon's HQ2, I mean, they were talking about 50,000 jobs
Exactly.
that were going to be located with that headquarters, new headquarters establishment. So I mean, that's, those are pretty high-paying jobs. And
Yeah,
so it's that kind of numbers that we really sort of don't have.
That's what comes with large corporations being headquartered, and especially around metropolitan areas. You get a lot of those higher-paying jobs, and it will certainly, and especially if you're talking about things like the banking industry, with how well positioned that we were in that, back in as early as the early 2000s. That comes with a lot of trickle-down effects. You have the possibility for greater levels of local capital allocation, and just all of the trickle-down economics that comes through that, with having those high-paying jobs being concentrated in those areas, and we're not seeing much of that right now.
And then we can also look at the Fortune 500 deals with publicly traded corporations, but the Forbes 400 richest Americans list can capture some of the privately held companies that might be quite prosperous, right?
And to that, it is more difficult to kind of identify, what the largest privately held company, for example, the Coke Industries. It's you kind of have to guess at what their market cap is. That data is not always available. So, like you said, looking at the business owners who own these very large corporations that are private, you can sort of see some of that in, well, what states do they live in? Who are the wealthiest people in America that are running these massive businesses, or have at least created these massive businesses and passed them on? Where are they living? And we see that they're pretty absent from Alabama. I think we have 0.
Yeah. Recently, that we've been at 0 on that list, and I think we were the largest population state not to have anybody on that list. And I mean, again, some of those people show up because they have a company that eventually went public. But that's another measure of past entrepreneurial success, having people from the Forbes 400 richest Americans. Now, at one level, many times if you look at a poor state in the country, I can give a relatively quick answer as to why they're poor, and as we can look at economic freedom, and we can see that they're down near the bottom of economic freedom, or they're up at near the top, and some having the highest taxes. Alabama's not quite like that, is it?
It is a little bit of a mystery how we have relatively attractive corporate tax rates, we have relatively attractive personal tax rates, as well as, like you said, having middling to above average economic freedom. And the fact that, those key indicators there aren't, really showing the same story that they show with a lot of other states, like you said. It does cause a little bit of a puzzle, and it makes you try and, reach out a little bit more and question, well, why are we seeing these particular cycles that we're seeing in the state, and why are we not kind of coming up to the creation of more large businesses and kind of keeping them domestic?
Now, you mentioned this, but your research has shown that although we have very few Fortune 500 companies now, that hasn't always been the case here now, and we've done better in the past, and
relatively recently.
And I think this is a list from 2000, right? So let's talk a little bit about this, because in the past we were obviously doing much better with 7 companies from the Fortune 500 headquartered in Alabama. But let's talk a little bit about some of these companies and their stories.
So if you want to get technical, we could say that we still have 2 because of the merger between AmSouth and Regions, and that has stayed local. However, one thing that when I started doing this research really kind of shocked me was that Saks, Saks Fifth Avenue most likely, that was actually headquartered in Birmingham for a long time. In fact, they achieved record sales numbers being headquartered in Birmingham. And I think they had moved from Knoxville right before that. They were branded as Profits and then kind of restructured. But we had HealthSouth. Obviously there was kind of a situation with that company, and that they still are, after their restructuring, they're still in the state, but they're no longer on the Fortune 500. And then SCI Systems, they were kind of almost a revolutionary player in the 1960s in Huntsville. You know, where that kind of gets into some of the research that I get into in the paper about how you can almost compare Huntsville in the 1960s with, you know, the aeronautical engineering and space exploration to almost like a Silicon Valley of their day in that industry. And they were really a massive success story, and for no clear reasons. I mean, they had some, you know, some turnover in their leadership, and just for no other reason other than, you know, people kind of retiring and you know, the business cycle moving on. But they have, you know, since relocated to San Jose, and they're, you know, I think they went through a merger as well. But what we see is that, you know, we have these, you know, fairly typical business life cycles going on, and it's not uncommon to see companies move, and there's no real explanation necessarily for why a company would move its headquarters from one place to another. You can explain it, you know, by, oh, well, Saks Fifth Avenue, you know, they want to move it. They ended up relocating to Manhattan. Oh, well, they want to move up there because they're a huge player in the fashion industry, and of course, you know, New York, Manhattan's going to be a, you know, a hot spot for that. And you can make some economies of agglomeration arguments for those sorts of things. But what we really see is that this happens in a lot of places, and there's generally going to be a lot of turnover. In fact, one of the kind of rarities is that Walmart has maintained its headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah, they've maintained their headquarters there for, you know, since inception, and that's kind of the exception, not the rule. Most companies, you know, do kind of go through that transition, and it might just be that the executives want to live somewhere else.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's no set, you know, reason for that happening. What we should see, though, is we should see that cycle continuing from the other side. And we should see new companies either moving into the area because there are opportunities here that attract them, or we should see growth coming from companies that are born in the state, and at least for some time, you know, achieving some success and staying domestic. You know, within, because we have some metropolitan areas, particularly Birmingham, that, you know, seems to have a lot of activity. It's just not necessarily the entrepreneurial growth activity that we'd like to see.
So I guess one way to think about this is that it's not that we needed to held on to these companies, because the Fortune 500 companies grow and it's going to change. I mean, you know, like since the 1950s, like 90% of the Fortune 500 is no longer with us. It turns over.
Yes.
It's just, you know, okay, business companies have their life cycle, and some of them are going to move on or decline or whatever. We have to have that next generation coming up. And that's not where, that seems to be where we've fallen behind. So we do know, let's talk a little bit about, from an economic theory standpoint, we talk about entrepreneurship, but like talk us a little bit about like why entrepreneurship is so important in economies and in economic growth.
Sure. So it may not be abundantly clear to, you know, everyone how important that entrepreneurship is, but it's widely recognized in economics, especially in the development literature, how important that entrepreneurship is to, you know, creation of opportunity. And one of the things that I think is most important with the whole story of why is entrepreneurship crucial to an economy is just growth. What you see a lot of times when you have this, you know, influx of new businesses into an area, and then you see that life cycle kind of play out, and then you look 10 years, 20 years afterwards. When there is stagnation will, the lack of growth will be detrimental 10, 20 years down the line. Okay. And so what's very important, I think, for us to understand about the importance of entrepreneurship is the importance of this development, the innovation, the building of new technologies, the overall penetrating into new markets and creating new opportunities that we don't currently have now. So it's important because if we want to think in terms of policy and how can I bring, as a policymaker, how can I bring prosperity, you know, in an economic sense to, you know, this group of people, my constituents? The question that I shouldn't be asking is, well, how do I get a business to come and give people jobs. The question that I should be asking is, how do I foster an environment for the people in this area to build things for themselves, to grow, to create new opportunities? Because it's impossible to plan these things out. And that's what the whole theory of entrepreneurship it really gets to, is that we don't want to be thinking about, from a policy perspective, trying to plan out our economy. We want to create institutions that really foster this development of growth and new opportunities.
So entrepreneurship therefore is really important, and there have been a number of different groups that have tried to measure entrepreneurship across different states, and that's a big part of what your research looked at here, to see how Alabama stands on a number of different measures of entrepreneurship. And so what have you found?
Well, it's not the best. It's not necessarily the worst, but it's not the best. A study from UNL, Lincoln, Nebraska, they ranked us 44th in total entrepreneurship, and that was the worst that we came out. And you can look there on the graph and see some of the other studies from Forbes, Fortune, and CBS, and where we ranked in terms of the other 50 states. But probably in terms of the literature on economics, one of the most recognized sources for measuring entrepreneurship from an empirical standpoint has got to be the Kauffman Foundation. And so as you can see on the graph here, we have those would be the 4 Kauffman indicators, we would call them. If you look on the Kauffman Index, and Kauffman has restructured and slightly kind of refocused their study, I suppose, but up until about 2 years ago, they worked off of what they called the Kauffman Index. And when you compare Alabama to the rest of the states, I think that we were the 6th or 7th worst in terms of total when you rank all of the 4 indicators there. But these indicators, I'll just explain them briefly. Rate of new entrepreneurs, fairly self-explanatory. It's just the number of new businesses that are being created within the state. Opportunity share, we'll get to in a little while.
Come back to that one.
Startup job creation is just for every new startup, how many jobs does it create? And then survival rates. The Kauffman survival rates, the one problem with it is that it only measures survival rates within the first year. So how many businesses stayed in business or went out of business within their first year. And so you can look and see that we're below average well below average in rate of new entrepreneurship. Opportunity share and startup job creation were a little bit below average, and then survival rate we're actually kind of right in the middle, and there might be some reasons for that.
So there is from a wide different number of measures support for the idea that we're certainly below average as well.
Yes.
In terms of entrepreneurship. Now, one of the things in the literature, and this is this opportunity share. We wanted to talk about this because when we go to measure entrepreneurship, many times we're looking at new businesses that are started. And not all businesses that get started are necessarily created equal or have the same kind of potential for Amazon type growth.
Exactly.
Right? So talk a little bit about that.
Well, no 2 businesses are created with the same intention. And I think that, and one of the things that we'll certainly be seeing, with the conditions that we're kind of under at the moment, and it's something that is that's pretty applicable for our current situation, is that what you see, especially in times of recession, is that business creation goes up drastically, and it's a function of the job market, the existing job market being poor, and it's people that create out of necessity. If creating a business is better than your next best option, if the job market is tough and you've been laid off of work, people go out and they start new businesses. Problem, and that is good from an entrepreneurship standpoint, but what we really want to look at in terms of the entrepreneurship that we're talking about, bringing massive companies into these areas where we can generate high-paying jobs. The Main Street type companies that we see be started in these times of economic recession, especially, but just that are captured in what we would call the necessity entrepreneurship. Those aren't going to kind of translate to the same kind of growth potential. And it's just simply because, if you're starting a mom and pop store, and it's something either that you're doing, because you have a passion for that thing, and you have this kind of relatively smaller scope and you want to serve the town. If it's something that you're creating a lawn care business, something that I did as a kid, growing up. There are all these things that the scope is going to be completely different. And when we're talking about opportunity entrepreneurship, that's typically going to be correlated with higher levels of risk, but also higher levels of potential reward. And as the entrepreneur, you have different goals going into that. When we're talking about necessity entrepreneurship, that's correlated with lower levels of risk, but also lower levels of potential reward. So when we're talking about, as we looked at the Kaufman indicator that showed survival rates, I think that one of the reasons that we see that we do fairly well, we're about average on survival rates, is that a lot of the businesses that are created in Alabama are created kind of out of this necessity, that they would fall under the necessity entrepreneurship category. And so with those being inherently less risky, well, of course, you're going to see fewer of those businesses fail. At the same time, fewer of those businesses are going to have that same growth potential, and not to diminish the value that small businesses bring whatsoever. But when we're talking about it in this context of we want to foster an environment where we can create high levels of opportunity entrepreneurship that can then lead to big corporations, large numbers of high-paying jobs, and the good benefits that we see with high levels of entrepreneurship, it just doesn't translate in the same way.
Yeah. So I mean, one way to think about this, Amazon was started to try to do something different back in the late 1990s to try to capture or get in on e-commerce, and it was started with the possibility of being big. And that's very different from somebody who...
Exactly. And I think a funny quote from Jeff Bezos is he told his parents, who invested $400,000 into his business, he told them there's a very high possibility. He actually assigned a percentage to it. I want to say it was greater than 70. So there's a greater than 70% chance, and if I'm misquoting him, I apologize, but it was something high. So there's a high percentage chance that you don't get any of your money back, that you lose your entire investment. And he went into that, realizing that he had a mandate that was something that was greater than what we would consider to be in the category of necessity entrepreneurship. It was pursuit of a great opportunity, and with that comes higher levels of risk.
In the term opportunity, there really probably goes back to like profit opportunity.
Exactly.
The economics literature, the idea of, there's some possible new good or service that could be provided in the economy, and it's a business that's trying to do something like that. Of course, for our economy, even when they fail, it's helpful because we learn that there maybe wasn't an opportunity there. But it's that person with the idea that it is a really big gamble that they're taking with a lot of upside if it turns out to be successful.
And it gets back to the importance of entrepreneurship. Like you said, when those types of ventures fail, it's a market signal that that service or that product is not in demand. And so even when you see failure in this risky entrepreneurship, it still serves a benefit.
Right.
And from the society standpoint, people need to be kind of excited about the growth in opportunity for these large-scale entrepreneurial ventures.
So this gets a little bit beyond the scope of what you were looking at here, because you're trying to document this. Where do we stand on these different measures of entrepreneurship?
Yeah.
But where does this lead us to go next? Because we've sort of you start out by saying like, okay, we're near the bottom in income and economic performance. And we don't have large companies, and we're looking to see it. It looks like we certainly don't have like the kind of opportunity startup companies that you might want. Although our companies tend to survive. So where do we go next from this to try to understand, unravel this puzzle?
$1 million question. So I think that where research needs to be focused, it needs to be focused in the growth areas. Like you said, typically you kind of come to the conclusion that like you said, you can usually look at a state and say, well, these are the reasons that that entrepreneurship is not happening. These are the reasons that poverty exists, or that they're not performing economically. Mm-hmm. We do fairly well in the corporate tax rates. We do fairly well in in incentives for businesses. So from a policy standpoint, it's difficult to point a finger and say this is the change that needs to be made, or this is the types of things we need to pursue. I think that really we should be focused on finding out how do we incentivize new business creation at the scale that we want to. How do we kind of shape our institutions to allow for, to encourage that? I think that some of the things that that Troy University is trying to start doing is can be really good for that. And I think that for the most part, it's a research question at the moment, mm-hmm. and not necessarily a here's the policy answer.
I mean, I guess one of the things that strikes me is that although overall economic freedom in the state isn't bad, and many times our business climate turns out reasonably good. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you dig down deeper into that, I wonder if there's possibly regulations or other things that could particularly hamper mm-hmm. small businesses as they attempt to grow. Because I mean, we seem to be okay in terms of businesses surviving mm-hmm. that first year or so.
Absolutely.
But then they don't necessarily seem to really take off. So I don't know if that's a question we'd have to look at.
Yeah, I think that's really where we need to focus most of the research is just looking at those problems of growth, and how do we allow for that? How do we incentivize that? And how do we kind of help to foster that environment?
And I mean, I guess the other thing is that by contrast, if you look next door in Georgia, I mean, mm-hmm. Atlanta has become such a center
exactly.
for so many corporations to have their headquarters.
Exactly.
It's certainly something we don't have, but it also, in some ways, it could be sort of a detriment for us, because mm-hmm. there's such an attractive place if you're starting a business and you want you start to have success, mm-hmm. To move your headquarters to Atlanta instead, right?
And their success and Georgia's success. In the same kind of economic statistics that we're looking at, really makes it difficult to make a geographics argument. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say, geographically we're located in an area that's just not conducive to that. Kind of rules that out. And mm-hmm. and I think that looking and seeing what are the things that they do, when you really get down into it and look at the policies and the regulations that they have, and kind of doing pairwise comparisons there, I think that there's some future in that.
Well, this has been very interesting. And any sort of concluding thoughts from what you've learned from this, and any takeaway points?
Yeah. So if I was summarizing the research, I suppose I would say, setting out to find whether there was an entrepreneurship problem or not that could explain some of the economic statistics that we have. I think that it's not necessarily definitive, but I think that there's certainly a high likelihood that it's contributing to that in a very major way. And I think that just based off of the empirical measures alone, I think that it's certainly an area where we need to start devoting research. And really, as economists that are interested in the success and future growth of the state, I think that it's a ripe area for future research.
And I think possibly also helping encourage students or young people, make them recognize that there's opportunities to start their own businesses, as opposed to necessarily attracting manufacturers who will come in and provide jobs, but
exactly.
they're not providing they're not bringing their headquarters here.
Yeah, really starting to realize the importance of kind of lifting up that next generation of business people. I think is going to be very important.
Well, thanks for coming on and talk about this.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.